The dust, kicked up by Margaret Whitfield's horse, settled like a golden veil over the Arizona territory as she brought her stallion to a halt at the edge of Cedar Ridge. The year was 1873, and the frontier town sprawled below her like a collection of wooden toys scattered across the desert floor. From her vantage point on the mesa, she could see the main street bustling with activity, wagons creaking along the rutted path, men in dusty hats moving between the saloon and the general store, women in long dresses hurrying about their daily business. Margaret's auburn hair had long since escaped the confines of the ribbon she had tied it with that morning. Strands whipped around her face in the desert wind, catching the late afternoon sunlight and gleaming like burnished copper. Her riding dress, practical but well-made, showed the signs of a hard day's ride across the unforgiving terrain. Dust coated her boots, and her cheeks were flushed from the sun and exertion, but her green eyes sparkled with an intensity that spoke of someone who had found exactly where they belonged. She had been riding since dawn, pushing her horse Thunder across miles of scrubland and rocky outcroppings, following game trails that most men would have lost within the first hour. But Margaret was not most people. She had learned to read the land the way other women read poetry, understanding the subtle signs that indicated water, shelter, and safety. The Apache who occasionally traded with the town had taught her some of their ways during the brief periods of peace, though those times were becoming increasingly rare as more settlers pushed into their ancestral lands. Thunder snorted and pawed the ground beneath him, his black coat gleaming with sweat. Margaret reached forward and patted his neck, murmuring words of praise in the mixture of English and Apache phrases she had picked up over the years. The stallion had been wild when she first encountered him 3 years ago, a magnificent creature that the local horsebreakers had declared impossible to tame. They had been wrong, of course. Margaret had not tried to break Thunder's spirit. Instead, she had earned his trust, spending weeks in patient observation, learning his moods and movements until the day he allowed her to approach. The townspeople below had watched that first ride with a mixture of awe and disapproval. Women simply did not ride the way Margaret Whitfield rode. They did not spend their days alone in the wilderness, did not return home with their hair wild and their eyes bright with adventure. They certainly did not form partnerships with horses that others considered dangerous, but Margaret had never been concerned with what others thought was proper for a woman. Her father, Samuel Whitfield, owned the largest ranch in the territory, a sprawling operation that stretched for thousands of acres across the high desert. He had built his empire through a combination of shrewd business sense, unwavering determination, and the ability to see potential where others saw only obstacles. It was a trait he had passed on to his daughter, though he sometimes wondered if he had given her too much freedom in developing it. Samuel had hired the best tutors money could buy to educate Margaret in the traditional accomplishments expected of a young lady of her station. She could speak French fluently, play the piano with considerable skill, and discuss literature and philosophy with an intelligence that impressed even the most educated men who visited the ranch. But her true education had come from the land itself, from the vaqueros who worked her father's cattle, from the Apache guides who had taught her to track and hunt, and from the horses that had shown her what it meant to move in perfect harmony with another living creature. As thunder shifted beneath her, Margaret caught sight of a dust cloud rising from the road that led into town from the east. A stagecoach was approaching, moving at the steady pace that indicated a routine arrival rather than an emergency. She watched with idle curiosity as the coach drew closer, noting the way the driver handled his team and the fact that there appeared to be several passengers inside. Cedar Ridge received regular stage service twice a week, bringing mail, supplies, and occasionally new residents to the growing community. Most of the arrivals were predictable: merchants hoping to establish businesses, families looking for fresh starts, or single men seeking their fortunes in the cattle trade. But sometimes the stage brought surprises, people whose presence would alter the careful balance of frontier life in ways no one could have anticipated. Margaret was about to turn Thunder away from the ridge and begin her descent into town when something about the approaching stagecoach caught her attention. One of the passengers had stuck his head out of the window, and even at this distance she could see that he was looking around with the alert, assessing gaze of someone who was taking careful note of everything he observed. This was not the casual curiosity of a tourist or the resigned patience of a routine traveler. This was the focused attention of someone who had come to Cedar Ridge for a specific purpose. She urged Thunder forward along the ridge, keeping pace with the stagecoach as it wound its way toward town. The passenger continued to observe the landscape with keen interest, occasionally pointing out features to someone else inside the coach. Margaret found herself wondering what had brought these strangers to her corner of the Arizona Territory. Cedar Ridge was not on the way to anywhere else. People came here because they intended to stay or because they had business that could not be conducted elsewhere. The stagecoach reached the outskirts of town and rolled down Main Street, drawing the attention of everyone within sight. Margaret watched as people emerged from buildings to see who had arrived, their faces showing the mixture of curiosity and wariness that frontier communities reserve for newcomers. In a place where everyone knew everyone else's business, strangers represented both opportunity and potential trouble. The coach came to a stop in front of the Frontier Hotel, a two-story wooden structure that served as Cedar Ridge's primary accommodation for visitors. Margaret could see the hotel owner, a portly man named Henderson, hurrying out to greet his new guests. Behind him came his wife, wiping her hands on her apron and smoothing her hair in preparation for introductions. 3 passengers emerged from the stagecoach, each one distinct enough that Margaret could make out their general characteristics, even from her elevated position. The first was an older gentleman in a well-tailored suit, carrying himself with the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. The second appeared to be a younger man, possibly in his 20s, dressed in practical traveling clothes, but with an air of refinement that suggested education and breeding. The third passenger was a woman, elegantly dressed despite the dust of travel, who moved with the careful grace of someone aware that she was being observed. Margaret felt a stirring of interest as she watched the newcomers interact with the townspeople gathering around the stagecoach. There was something about their bearing, the way they carried themselves and responded to questions, that suggested they were not ordinary travelers. The older man, in particular, seemed to command immediate respect, though Margaret could not hear the conversations taking place below. Thunder pawed the ground again, reminding her that they had been standing still for quite some time. Margaret realized that her horse was right. They had been watching the scene in town for longer than she had intended. The sun was beginning to sink toward the western horizon, painting the desert in shades of gold and orange that would soon deepen to crimson and purple. It would be dark within a few hours, and she still had to make her way down from the ridge and back to the ranch. But as she prepared to turn away, something happened that froze her in place. The younger man who had emerged from the stagecoach looked up toward the ridge where she sat on Thunder, and for a moment their eyes met across the distance. Even at this remove, Margaret could sense the intensity of his gaze, the way he seemed to study her with the same careful attention he had been giving to the landscape. She felt a flush of self-consciousness as she realized what he must be seeing. A young woman sitting astride a powerful horse on a rocky outcropping, her hair loose and wild from the wind, dressed in practical riding clothes rather than the elaborate gowns that marked a lady of refinement. She knew that by the standards of polite society, she must appear shockingly improper, a frontier oddity who had forgotten the constraints that should govern feminine behavior. But instead of the disapproval she expected to see, the young man below raised his hand in a gesture that might have been a greeting or an acknowledgement of her presence. There was something in his posture, even at this distance, that suggested not criticism but appreciation, as if he understood something about what he was observing that others might miss. Margaret found herself raising her own hand in response, an automatic gesture that she immediately regretted. She had no business exchanging greetings with strangers, particularly not from such a dramatic vantage point that made her appear to be showing off. Her father had taught her to be courteous to visitors, but there were proper ways to make introductions, and signaling from horseback across a quarter-mile of desert was not one of them. Embarrassed by her impulsive response, Margaret wheeled Thunder around and urged him away from the edge of the ridge. The stallion responded instantly to her guidance, picking his way carefully down the steep trail that led toward the valley floor. As they descended, Margaret could feel her heart beating faster than the moderate exertion warranted, and she found herself replaying the brief moment of connection with the stranger below. It had been years since any man had looked at her with what seemed like genuine interest, rather than disapproval or calculation. The eligible bachelors in Cedar Ridge and the surrounding ranches fell into predictable categories: rough cowboys who were intimidated by her education and independence, or ambitious fortune seekers who saw her primarily as a path to her father's wealth and influence. Neither type held any appeal for Margaret, who had long ago decided that she would rather remain unmarried than settle for a man who could not appreciate both her spirit and her intelligence. But there had been something different about the way the stranger had looked at her, something that suggested he might see her wild ride not as evidence of improper behavior, but as a demonstration of skill and courage. It was a reaction so unexpected that Margaret found herself hoping she would have the opportunity to discover whether her first impression had been accurate. The trail down from the ridge required careful attention, winding between boulders and crossing several washouts where spring floods had carved new channels in the earth. Thunder navigated the obstacles with the sure-footed confidence of a horse who had traveled this route many times before, but Margaret knew better than to become complacent. The desert was beautiful, but unforgiving, and accidents happened to riders who let their attention wander. By the time they reached the valley floor, the sun had sunk low enough to cast long shadows across the landscape. Margaret turned Thunder toward home, following a well-worn path that led across grazing land toward the cluster of buildings that marked the headquarters of the Whitfield Ranch. In the distance, she could see cattle scattered across the range, dark shapes moving slowly across the pale grass as they searched for the day's final grazing before settling in for the night. The ranch house came into view as they crested a low hill, a sprawling adobe structure that had grown organically over the years as Samuel Whitfield's success had allowed him to add new wings and improvements. The original building had been a simple four-room cottage, but it now included a formal parlor, a library, a dining room large enough to entertain business associates, and sleeping quarters for family and guests. The architecture reflected both practical frontier concerns and Samuel's desire to demonstrate that civilization could flourish even in the wilderness. Smoke was rising from the kitchen chimney, indicating that Rosa, the family's longtime housekeeper and cook, was preparing the evening meal. Margaret could already imagine the aroma of Rosa's famous beef stew, seasoned with herbs from the garden she maintained behind the house. The thought reminded her that she had eaten nothing since the early morning breakfast that had preceded her day-long ride, and her stomach responded with a growl of anticipation. As she approached the house, Margaret could see her father standing on the wide front porch, his hands clasped behind his back as he gazed out over his domain. Samuel Whitfield was a man in his 50s, tall and lean from a lifetime of physical work, with graying hair and a weather-beaten face that spoke of decades spent under the desert sun. He possessed the quiet authority of someone who had built something significant through his own efforts and was not inclined to apologize for his success. Samuel looked up as he heard Thunder's hoofbeats, and Margaret could see him checking the position of the sun to gauge how long she had been gone. It was a habit of his, this careful monitoring of her whereabouts and activities, born not from distrust, but from genuine concern for her safety in a land where danger could appear without warning. Apache raiding parties, though less common than in previous years, were still a real threat, and even experienced riders could find themselves in trouble if their horses went lame or they encountered unexpected weather. Margaret guided Thunder to the hitching post near the front porch and swung down from the saddle with the fluid motion of someone who had been mounting and dismounting horses since childhood. Thunder stood quietly as she loosened the saddle cinch and removed the bit from his mouth, allowing him to graze on the sparse grass that grew near the water trough. Samuel descended the porch steps and approached his daughter, his eyes taking in her disheveled appearance with the practiced assessment of a man who could read stories in dust patterns and torn fabric. Margaret knew that he could tell from the condition of her clothes and Thunder's sweat marks exactly how hard and how far they had ridden, and she braced herself for the gentle lecture that usually followed her more adventurous excursions. Instead, Samuel surprised her by asking, "Did you see the stagecoach arrive in town?" Margaret nodded, suddenly realizing that her father's presence on the porch might not have been coincidental. Samuel Whitfield made it his business to know everything that happened in the territory, and the arrival of new people was always a matter of interest to him. As one of the most successful ranchers in the region, he wielded considerable influence in local affairs, and visitors often sought him out for advice, assistance, or business opportunities. "I watched from the ridge," Margaret admitted. There appeared to be 3 passengers, well-dressed and carrying themselves like people of some importance. "Do you know who they are?" Samuel's expression grew thoughtful. "I received word yesterday that we might be expecting visitors from back east. Men with government connections, asking questions about land usage and treaty negotiations with the Apache. The kind of questions that usually precede significant changes in policy." Margaret felt a chill that had nothing to do with the cooling desert air. Government interest in the territory often meant trouble for everyone involved, from the ranchers who had built their lives on the frontier to the Apache who had watched their traditional hunting grounds steadily shrink as more settlers arrived. Treaty negotiations in particular had a way of satisfying no one while creating new sources of conflict. "What kind of changes?" she asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. Samuel shook his head. "Nothing definite yet, but there's talk in Washington about establishing a formal reservation system, moving all the Apache onto designated lands and opening the rest of the territory for unrestricted settlement. The kind of plan that looks neat and orderly on a map, but ignores everything about how people actually live out here." Margaret had grown up hearing stories about the complex relationships between the various groups that called the Arizona Territory home. The Apache had been here for generations, developing an intimate understanding of the land that allowed them to thrive in conditions that challenged even experienced frontiersmen. The Mexican settlers who had arrived during the period of Spanish rule had created their own accommodation with the landscape and its original inhabitants. The Anglo settlers who had come more recently, people like her father, had had to learn through trial and error how to adapt their expectations to frontier realities. The idea of simply drawing lines on a map and declaring that different groups must live within arbitrary boundaries struck her as the kind of simplistic solution that bureaucrats might devise without understanding its practical implications. But she also knew that pressure was mounting in Washington to do something about the Indian problem, and politicians were always looking for approaches that could be implemented quickly and presented to voters as decisive action. "Have you met these visitors?" Margaret asked. "Not yet, but I expect I will soon enough. Men like that don't travel all the way out here just to see the scenery. They'll want to talk to the local landowners, get our perspective on how their policies might work in practice." Samuel's tone carried a note of skepticism that suggested he had little confidence in the government's ability to devise workable solutions to complex problems. Margaret found herself thinking again about the moment when the young stranger had looked up at her from the street below. If he was indeed part of a government delegation, then their brief exchange of gestures took on a different significance. She wondered what conclusions he might have drawn from seeing her mounted on Thunder, and whether those conclusions would influence whatever recommendations he might make about life in the territory. The sound of the dinner bell ringing from the kitchen interrupted her thoughts. Rosa had a strict schedule for meals, and she expected the family to appear promptly when summoned. Margaret realized that she needed to clean up and change her clothes before sitting down to eat, particularly if there was any possibility that they might receive visitors in the coming days. Samuel seemed to read her thoughts. "You might want to consider wearing one of your more formal dresses tomorrow," he suggested gently. "If these government men do come calling, it would be good for them to see that we've maintained civilized standards out here." Margaret nodded, understanding the subtext of her father's words. In the eyes of Eastern politicians and bureaucrats, the frontier was often seen as a place where civilization broke down, where people reverted to primitive behaviors and abandoned the social conventions that maintained order in more settled regions. If Samuel was going to argue effectively for policies that took local conditions into account, he needed to demonstrate that frontier communities were capable of sophisticated thought and responsible self-governance. She gathered Thunder's reins and led him toward the corral where the other horses spent their nights. The stallion followed willingly, his head lowered in the relaxed posture of a horse who knew he was returning to familiar territory. Margaret took her time removing his saddle and bridle, using the routine tasks to process the day's experiences and prepare herself for whatever challenges the next few days might bring. As she worked, Margaret found her thoughts returning repeatedly to the stranger who had acknowledged her presence from the street below. There had been something in that brief moment of connection that suggested possibilities she had not previously considered, though she could not yet define what those possibilities might be. All she knew for certain was that the arrival of the government delegation had introduced new variables into the carefully balanced equation of frontier life, and she had the distinct feeling that nothing would remain quite the same. The evening star was beginning to shine in the darkening sky as Margaret finished caring for Thunder and made her way toward the house. Tomorrow would bring whatever it would bring, but tonight there would be Rosa's cooking, her father's company, and the familiar comfort of the home they had built together in the middle of the vast Arizona desert. For now, that was enough.